everyone. This is Outside the Wall, an exclusive club for people who are very open to their friends' suggestions. My name is Xdeath, and I'm joined by Wally, my co-host.
Hello.
And although he doesn't meet our club's requirements, Raim is here too.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about Pom Poko, a 1994 animated film by Isao Takahata, which forms the second half of our Isao Takahata fortnight and, without any intention, coincidentally forms the first half of our Cock and Balls fortnight. The way that we came to this movie is that Raim has a terrible phobia of testicles, so I suggested it as a way to help him overcome that. And that's all the intro we need, and I'll turn over to Wally for his opinion.
So, yes, this was the third Studio Ghibli film that we have seen. We have seen as a group, and that I have seen total. And it's, I think, still Grave of Fireflies might be my favorite out of the trio. This is definitely the most authentic towards Japanese culture of the group of them that we've seen, or out of any of the anime that I've seen anyway. So there can be sort of a disconnect between some of the things they're talking about culturally, like some of the mysticism and the religious aspects of it. For like a modern Western audience, Japanese name for these creatures, but they're very raccoon-like. And it's in the 1960s, the post-war years of Japan, as they're kind of rebuilding and westernizing after World War II. And the tanuki have their local town or village, which is essentially a forest, increasingly being encroached upon by the humans as they're building up the city of, I think it's Kyoto, either Kyoto or Tokyo. And so they try and have desperate measures to try and prevent the humans from doing this. There are some factions within the Tanuki clans that one wants a more violent response, whereas there's a younger group that wants a more peaceful coexistence. And it just pans out other clans, Tanuki clans nearby, to try and do this, and it winds up wrapping up with this big long festival that is supposed to scare the humans out of the area, but winds up being commandeered by the humans as a sort of marketing purpose, which I thought was kind of tongue-in-cheek and a bit clever. But overall, I think I do enjoy this. I do enjoy Studio Ghibli films in general. Their animation still, even with this, is very well done. But I think I'll leave it at that. And Raim, your thoughts?
Okay, so this was, I think when I watched this, it was probably my 12th Ghibli film. But yeah, this is the third one that we watched together. And I very much enjoyed this, a lot more than I really expected, actually. And this is also my fourth Isao Takahata film, if I remember correctly. I've also seen, besides Grave of the Fireflies that we watched together, it was our previous episode. I've also seen Only Yesterday and The Tale of Princess Kaguya. Princess Kaguya being his last film that Isao Takahata made. And I think that his director work is really commendable. He's actually, I think a lot of people tend to, let's say that they don't mention him as much as Hayao Miyazaki, but his work is truly great. And I consider that Kaguya is definitely his best work, even if he wasn't like trying to do a magnum opus there. Seeing how the works that he did before, and Grave of the Fireflies and Pom Poko, this, I think that it is to say that he was really a great animation director. And Pom Poko was, actually quite endearing. As Wally mentioned, the Tanukis, they have this, throughout the film, it's like there's this narrator explaining about the Tanuki culture and what they're facing. I think that it is Tokyo actually, where they are, that it's been industrialized. And the Tanukis basically can shapeshift. They explain that some of the animals, like foxes and I think even some cats, if I remember correctly, can shapeshift. So what they are doing is that they're trying to push away the humans through their shapeshifting, even sometimes transforming shapeshifting into humans, so they can like infiltrate and sabotage in what I believe Evil Dex had mentioned as eco-terrorism. It is a quite actually an endearing movie. And some of the animation sequences are, I think the festival sequence is quite a treat to watch, even if that in a sense backfires within the film itself. I mean the plot, like it backfired for the Tanukis, not that it backfired in any case. It is, I think, despite it was longer than Grave of the Fireflies, it is actually quite entertaining throughout. There wasn't really a sequence where I said that I felt that it dragged too long. There's actually the entire process of the Tanuki clans coming together, then their internal struggles, the things that they were trying to, the shortage of food that they were going through because the forest was getting smaller and smaller. I think that was actually very well done. Yeah, this to an extent, this is actually a good fall to The Grave of the Fireflies that we watched last time, because The Grave of the Fireflies was quite consuming, emotionally consuming, and this one is, despite not necessarily having, like, let's say, a true happy ending, it is actually bittersweet, I will say, but in a way that it does so gracefully. So, Evil Dex.
All right. So I was going into this movie kind of expecting a lesser Ghibli work, but I was ended up being quite impressed actually. I think we can see a bit of a common theme between these two movies, this and Grave of the Fireflies, in that both of them involve the main characters sort of fighting a losing struggle, which I think is quite touching in both films. In fact, of the two of them, I got through Grave of the Fireflies without shedding a tear, but I actually cried watching this movie during a sequence near the end when the tanuki accept that they've lost and their home will never come back, but use their power of shapeshifting to reminisce about it one last time. I thought that in particular was quite moving. This is a very good example of how to do a film with a very strong and overt message behind it in a way that doesn't really undermine the art of the storytelling in particular. It makes a positive contrast, I think, against some American films that use this kind of pro-environmentalism subject matter, particularly James Cameron's Avatar, I would say, where there's a sort of military force invading the planet of Pandora and exploiting the mineral resources and so on. And they're defeated through quite contrived means to get this kind of happy gung-ho ending, which is quite averted in this case, where the forces of nature thoroughly lose, which seems to be the case in reality as well. I appreciated that. And additionally, something that I think is quite commendable is that the tanuki, who are being these representations of the positive nature that the film wants to promote, are nonetheless highly disorganized, prone to arguing, and full of comedic character flaws, which makes them overall much more enjoyable to watch and easier to relate to. A good example of this actually comes during the sort of planned reproduction that Rain was talking about, where this granny basically advocates that they don't have kids, and two of the main heroes talk about how they're going to go along with that plan and then just immediately get really horny and have a bunch of kids anyways. That was quite a funny moment and speaks to the sort of flawed characterization that the tanuki were given, which I appreciated a lot. So on the whole, I'm actually very fond of this film and would highly recommend it, even though it does base itself quite heavily on some of the weirder aspects of Japanese culture, particularly the fact that the tanuki's testicles are always visible and that their transforming power is particularly acute in that area of the body. So yeah, highly recommended. That's all I'll say on it.
Yes, I was going to that point. Would you consider this a family film?
Well, I watched it when I was a kid, actually, and I didn't. It was funny how we started, like how the idea to watch this together first came up. I was sort of reminiscing about watching it as a kid to Rain, and he thought that it would be quite a traumatic experience. But the way that I remember it is that both my siblings, and I thought it was very funny at the time.
Well, I think it definitely, as an American, I think it's another example of one of these movies that we've seen that might not have translated very well to
Mm-hmm.
an American audience, which I think even you, Exeth, might have mentioned that the translation of their balls had changed to like their pouch, I think, or
Yeah, in the dub they
lines.
call it the raccoon pouch in the old dub, yeah. Which just comes off as its popular Studio Ghibli films with Western audiences. And I think that is partially because it's so heavily steeped in Japanese culture that it's a little bit more a little bit harder for people in other cultures to kind of get into it. But I agree with you that that doesn't really detract from the film, even from a Western perspective. It's pretty easy to get into it eventually.
I don't think you need some kind of degree in Japanese culture or literature to understand or appreciate the film at all.
No. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think the testicles are probably more of an issue for prudish adults than they are for kids, really.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I think this is actually quite a family film, even if it does have some things that wouldn't be understood that early in life. But I have to say that you, as I mentioned when we were watching the film, I think you overblew the testicle constriction that they were going through. Sounding, you describe it kind of a bit torturous.
Well, I would contend with that. I'm actually going to post. I'm going to flash up the original post that I made for the viewers here so that they can determine this a little bit. Because I agree that it wasn't very well phrased, but I really don't see how you thought it was torture, a description of torture.
Might be a problem lost in translation there.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, no, I think one of the as we had mentioned, I think I don't want to get too much into talking about more the ending too early. But what you have mentioned about them being of a flawed characters, that Tanuki is one of the things that they mention throughout the film and they showcase throughout the film is that they are a bit more of a lazy group of animals in general. They're giving more to a more relaxed lifestyle, and they actually suffer a lot about this early because they have to. The shape shifting requires some discipline, so actually not all of them are able to shapeshift, and this actually ties in a lot in the plot about how some of them can't shapeshift at all and can't thus eventually meld into the human society. So that
Yeah, so just to explain briefly, because I think this might be missed by some viewers the way you're describing it. At the end, once the tanuki have accepted the fact that they're going to lose the forest, they decide to use their shapeshifting powers to impersonate humans and kind of blend into human society as the only means of survival they have left.
Yes, to me that actually was quite a nice touch for the end because it sort of ties into this sort of realism in Japanese culture that these eccentric or goofy people may not really be people. They might just be the tanuki shapeshifting essentially, or any other creature shapeshifting. So it lends, I think, very well to that sort of mysticism that's in Japanese culture.
Yeah, and it's always nice when you have this more fantastical premise if the writers think through the different applications that it could potentially have. So, this idea of them sort of permanently shapeshifting to blend into human society is pretty creative as well and shows that they were thinking about those potential applications.
indeed, and it's also the limitations of them are set up that it's not like they just can shapeshift into anything at any time. As a matter of fact, even the greatest of the shapeshifting masters don't show up until very late into the film, kind of like that last third, if I remember correctly. And they're the ones that help them. Even the force of exertion necessary to make the festival sequence gets one of them to pass away.
Yeah, the
So
Luke Skywalker style of death.
yeah, so I'd say that
Well,
this was a bit better executed since
Yes.
we were clear on the exertion that they foreshadowed that such an event could cause one of them to pass away.
yes. Well, the other nice touch too towards the end is how they stay consistent with sort of their limitations in their shape shifting. So you see the human tanukis basically going in these shops and drinking what is essentially like the 90s version of 5 Hour Energy in order to maintain their ability of shape shifting, which is a nice touch. And also, again, I think speaks to some modern cultures and maybe that's cute creative way of looking and say, oh, because the coffee or caffeine industry has grown because of these shape-shifting animals.
Yeah, that the detail to the limitations being applied is pretty nice. They do require quite a lot of energy to keep their shape, and I believe they actually mentioned that in the film that the black eyes, the eyes are of tiredness, of exhaustion is actually the Tanuki have is because of that shape shifting, how consuming it is for them.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so something else I appreciated along with the sort of limits of the powers that they have is that the Tanuki are also very fractious among themselves and will quarrel quite often, both about how to respond to the situation they're facing and just in general. I think that's another thing that makes them into more interesting characters and just kind of makes the film more fun in general.
Oh yeah, so regarding the fictitiousness of them, I actually quite like that they the Tanuki group that we see throughout the film is actually they were initially two different bands that were fighting like in a war amongst themselves, but they band together after the forest is being shrunk by the industrialization. However, their differences don't disappear overnight, and that's really nice. There's actually throughout the film there I actually have a lot of struggles. There's even a short-lived coup done by Gonta because he's advocating for waiting until the old masters of shapeshifting arrive and teach them new techniques that can get them to solve this problem in a way that the humans will actually revere them rather than going into a war of mutual genocide. And this actually lasts throughout the entire film. It's a common recurrence that that Tanuki have, and it's done in a way that it's understandable why they will want to do this, since they're dying, they're being captured, the forest is being shrunk. But while some want a more peaceful resolution, and others want a more militaristic one, let's say, it doesn't really just there are differences of perhaps what might have been decades of warring factions don't just disappear on a single night. So yeah, I thought that was really nice.
Right, and I think it also, especially when we're talking about the coup that takes place by the more militant faction, also showcases their one of their flaws in the Tanuki characters, in that they are so focused on food and eating that they kind of forget the whole coup to begin with, and just kind of go back to their very lackadaisical mindset. If only more coups in real life could end that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so I
So,
think another thing that film manages a little bit of complexity with is in how it portrays human society as well. Because I think, again, one of these more less artistic American films would have basically portrayed the humans as really, really evil. And I think this film's perspective is pretty obvious, but it has Tanuki sort of have certain statements of respect for humanity, and it doesn't make them appear as greedy, for example, in their general expansion. So that was also a nice touch, I think.
right, and I think in showing like some of the normal activities of humans, including just some of the reactions that children have, I think also helps to, for lack of a better word, humanize the humans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very interesting that it needs to be done that way. It's the humans being humanized, as it were.
Even if there is that feeling, as you mentioned, of having this ecological message to it, it's not as like that in your face, like oh, humans evil, and they're all just. Even I think that it showcases more of it as more being like a systematical program. It's more about these institutions rather than just being like a clear human face that oh this is the bad guy. He's the one that's actually being the one that's trying to destroy the forest and kill the tanuki, and he's the only
Yeah.
evil one. The rest of humans are good and something like that. And even the actions, like Wally mentioned this, I believe in the intro. One of the I actually like it a lot too. How the actions that they take when they do the festival of monsters and ghosts to try to scare the humans, and humans there's this like theme park that's trying to be open up like some kind of Wonderland, Happy Land. I actually forgot the name specifically, but the thing is that the the board of directors of this place actually use this as positive marketing. Like they like whoever did this just gave us the perfect opportunity to market our theme park, and they just it was us. It was actually us. We're sorry that we disturbed the peace of the neighborhoods, but it was us. And the Tanukis are like, what?
Yes, the real villains are the marketing people.
Yeah, I guess they are the closest thing this film has to a villain. Because you're right, Raymond. It doesn't really have a proper single villain. Yeah, I think that scene kind of just shows like the chaotic and unpredictable nature of life to a certain extent, which I think is a good like minor theme for a sort of artistic film to have. I think that is kind of the takeaway is that although this movie is far from subtle with its messaging, it does manage to do that in a way that is still pretty artistic.
Yes, it doesn't follow some of the common tropes in what you'd see in a more Western film.
Yeah, so I think some of those examples like Avatar and I think Illumination did one, the Lorax, based on Dr. Seuss one. Those are not very artistic at all in their pro-environmentalist messaging.
Well, I think also, obviously, what works for this film too is the fact that it uses anthropomorphic creatures to portray this message that they're trying to get across. Which, I mean, there's numerous examples. Fantastic Mr. Fox is one that we've seen and talked about here. One of the more classic ones is Animal Farm, and I think that strength is very potent here because not only can they explore some of these themes without getting too politicized in the modern discourse, but it also, I think, allows it to be appreciated by younger audiences, which is Totoro.
Yeah, it also kind of gives a certain comedic tone to the overall proceedings, which something like Avatar doesn't really have either. Avatar's, I would say, definitely more serious minded in comparison to this. I think that's a compliment to this one because
Yes.
it prevents it from becoming a little bit too preachy, as people would say.
Well, going back to Isao, talk about a bit more. This, if I remember correctly, this was his last film where he used the standard animation of cell animation that they call in Studio Ghibli. I believe that after that he did My Neighbor Llamadas, The Neighbor Llamadas, and they use quite a different animation style. But I think even here there's as I mentioned, there's a lot of sequences that are quite good to it, and I think that Isao does, I think, or tries to try to take care into movies that the soundtrack itself it blends in a bit more with the sequences, and it become a more natural, let's say, part of this setting, rather than just being like bombastic or like trying to overly explain what is going on and the emotion of the characters. I think I noticed that a bit more here in Pom Poko and Kaguya. So I think that's something else that is to be taken notice of in a film like Pom Poko.
Although I should say, I meant to bring this up in my initial speech, but forgot. My one criticism of this film, I think, is that it kind of over relies on narration. There's like a narration that goes kind of throughout the whole film, and I think at times it does lead to some too unsubtle storytelling.
Isn't the narration in the end basically Chokuichi explaining their story?
Yeah, that's part of it.
And it's like a retrospective, and then the
But sometimes in a visual medium like this, you can kind of communicate the same things without narration. I think even in Bomboko, certain scenes where the narration is used might be able to play out without it and not really lose anything.
could be, yeah. There's quite a
And
lot of it. I think it's in a sense because it perhaps to an extent that also helps us understand more of the culture and the context being explained. Since there's quite a lot of info dumps in it.
Yeah, well, in a way, this is kind of an epic of a film, actually, because it stretches out over a long period of time and involves quite a large number of different characters and groups. So I think that is part of the reason why this narration was employed so heavily, just so that we can kind of understand the histories of all these different groups and things like that that are difficult to explain in a more natural way.
well, I think too, because it seems to be geared much more towards a family oriented film, I think that narration helps too for younger audiences who may not be wise enough yet to pick up on just some visual cues.
Yeah, that is definitely one purpose it serves.
I don't know if you have anything else to say about it.
Just the one thing I forgot to mention in my overall impressions is that I think of all three of the Ghibli films that I have seen, this definitely is the most impressive in terms of its animation, particularly when they're focusing on the parade through the city. I think definitely is much more bombastic, much more flashy than the other Ghibli films we've seen, and I think it's pretty much is because it's tying into a lot of this culture and mystic history of Japanese culture.
I guess we can leave it at that then. So, summarize, although some of the more unusual, very Japanese will firmly fall within the fun for all the family category of animated film, where it can be enjoyed by kids and adults alike. And I think all three of us are unanimous in giving it a recommendation.
Yes.
So thanks for tuning in. This has been Outside the Wall, and we'll see you next time.